could have taken it. No one was watching, no cameras, no witnesses, just his hands, the dark of the garage, and a hidden compartment that held something capable of changing his life forever. But Ethan Walker closed it shut. That moment belonged to no one but him, and it was precisely that moment, unseen, unwitnessed, unrewarded, that made the most powerful woman in the global automotive industry stop everything she thought she knew about people and look twice at a man who ran a small repair shop in a town most maps forgot to label. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. If it moves you, hit like and stay with me until the very last word. You won't regret it. The rain came in sideways that Tuesday night, the kind that found every gap in a jacket and didn't apologize for it. Cedar Ridge had that particular stillness that small towns get after 8 in the evening. The gas station on Mercer Street down to one working pump, and a teenager inside more interested in his phone than the fuel gauge. The diner on Route 9 already flipping its sign. The stoplight at the center of town blinking yellow, because whoever controlled that sort of thing had decided after dark there wasn't enough traffic to bother with red and green. Ethan Walker was still in the garage. He'd been there since 6 that morning, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that it was now 9:47 at night, and he had a 7-year-old boy asleep on the old leather couch he'd dragged in from a yard sale 3 years ago and placed in the corner of the office. The couch that had become Noah's unofficial second bedroom on the nights when Mrs. Garfield, their neighbor, and the closest thing either of them had to a safety net, had her book club, or her sister visiting from Raleigh, or whatever else came up that made her unavailable. The couch was showing its age. One armrest was wrapped in duct tape. The cushions had been compressed by enough nights of a small boy curled beneath a fleece blanket that they'd basically given up trying to bounce back. But Noah slept soundly on it, one arm hanging off the side, his sneakers still on because Ethan hadn't had the heart to wake him when he'd carried him in from the truck 2 hours ago. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag that was too far gone to do much good and looked over at the boy. 7 years old, missing a front tooth since last Thursday. Had asked Ethan that morning whether the tooth fairy was real, with the specific kind of deadpan skepticism that 7-year-olds deploy when they already suspect the answer but want to see if you'll lie to them. Ethan hadn't lied. He'd said, "What do you think?" And Noah had looked at him with those dark eyes. His mother's eyes, the one feature that still caught Ethan off guard some mornings, and said, "I think it's you, but I want the $1 anyway." He'd gotten the $1. Ethan was in the middle of reassembling the brake caliper on a 2019 Ford F-15. Oh, that belonged to Ray Pullman, who coached the junior high baseball team and needed the truck back by Thursday because he was hauling equipment to a tournament in Asheville. It was careful work. Ray didn't have a lot of money and had been nervous about the estimate, so Ethan had gone through the cost line by line, explained what was necessary and what could wait, and had watched the man's shoulders drop about 2 inches when the number came in lower than he'd feared. That was the job. Not just fixing the mechanical thing, managing the anxiety of people who depended on machines they didn't fully understand and couldn't afford to have fail. He heard the truck before he saw it. Heavy, expensive. The kind of engine that had been tuned to be quiet but couldn't quite suppress the low authority of real displacement. It slowed on the road outside, and Ethan figured it was someone turning around. People occasionally used his lot at night for that. But then the headlights swept across the bay door and the truck pulled in. Not a truck. A car. Even through the rain-blurred garage door window, the lines were unmistakable. A Bentley Continental GT, charcoal gray. The kind of vehicle that had no reasonable explanation for being on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, North Carolina, at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday in November. 2 men got out. Both in dark jackets, not the kind you bought at Target. One of them, shorter, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, walked to the garage bay door and knocked with his knuckle rather than his fist, which Ethan had always thought was a telling detail about a person. He set down the caliper and walked over. "We're closed," he said through the door. "I understand," the man said. His voice was clipped, professional. "We have a vehicle that needs service. We were told you were the best mechanic in the county." "You were told wrong. I'm the only mechanic in the county still open past 8. He unlatched the door anyway, because the rain was genuinely awful, and because turning people away had never sat right with him. "Come in." The 2 men stepped inside. The shorter one did the talking. The taller one stood near the bay entrance and looked at everything and said nothing, which Ethan recognized as the behavior of someone whose job was to look at everything and say nothing. "We need to leave the vehicle here for service," the shorter man said. "We'll arrange pickup when it's ready." "What's wrong with it?" "We'd prefer your assessment." Ethan looked past him toward the Bentley, sitting in the lot with rain sheeting off its roof. "I'd need to look at it." "Of course." "Tonight?" "Whenever is convenient for you." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. He still had Ray's brake caliper to finish. He had a boy asleep on a couch. He had a gas bill due Friday and a water heater in the apartment above the garage that had been making a sound for 2 weeks that he was actively choosing not to investigate because he suspected what it would tell him. "Pull it in," he said. The man produced an envelope from inside his jacket. Sealed. His name, Walker. Written on the front in clean capital letters, black ink, fountain pen from the look of it. "The owner's instructions are inside," the man said, "along with contact information for billing." "You're not the owner?" "No." "The owner's not coming?" "Not tonight." Ethan took the envelope. "What's the name on the account?" The man smiled, just barely. "The envelope has everything you need." Then both men walked back out into the rain, got into a separate vehicle that had been idling on the road, a black SUV Ethan hadn't noticed until now, and left. The Bentley sat in his lot like a question he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the taillights of the SUV disappear down the road toward the highway, rain bouncing off the asphalt in the yellow glow of his one functioning exterior light. Then he went back inside, washed his hands, finished Ray Pullman's brake caliper, and covered the F-150 for the night. Only then did he open the envelope. Inside was a single card, cream-colored and thick, the kind of cardstock that costs more than most people would believe paper could cost. The handwriting on it was precise and feminine, not flowery, but controlled. The kind of handwriting produced by someone who had learned to present themselves carefully. "Mr. Walker, please assess the vehicle and repair only what is necessary. Do not perform any work beyond what is mechanically required. Full payment will be remitted upon completion. Contact number is provided below. Please do not discuss the vehicle or this arrangement with anyone. No name. A phone number with a 212 area code, New York." That was it. Ethan read it twice, then set it on his workbench and went to look at the Bentley. He pulled it into the bay, which required some shuffling of the F-150 and his own truck, but he managed. The Bentley was immaculate on the outside. No body damage, no scrapes. The paint still had that deep, almost liquid quality that only came from professional detailing within the last few weeks. He ran his hand along the rear quarter panel out of habit, not a mark. He plugged in his diagnostic reader and let it run while he did a visual inspection. The tires were relatively new. The brakes looked good from the outside. He popped the hood. The engine was a 6.0-liter twin-turbo W12. He'd only seen one of these in person before, at a car show in Charlotte 4 years ago, and he hadn't been able to touch it, just look. He took his time looking now, going through the checks with the same methodical care he gave every vehicle. Fluid levels, belt condition, any visible leaks, the integrity of the connections. Nothing dramatic jumped out. Whatever the issue was, it wasn't announcing itself visibly. He climbed inside the car to check the diagnostic results on his reader. The interior was something else. Leather so soft it barely felt like leather. The kind of quiet inside the cabin that made you aware of the absence of noise, but no road sound, no wind, just engineered silence. The wood trim on the dash was real, he could tell by the grain variations. The seat adjusted automatically when he sat down, like it was trying to accommodate him. He focused on the diagnostic readout. 2 fault codes. A minor misfire on cylinder 7 that had likely been caused by a spark plug reaching end of life, and a secondary oxygen sensor flagging intermittently. Probably a loose connection rather than a failed sensor, but he'd need to test it to be sure. Neither issue was catastrophic. The car was drivable. Whoever owned this vehicle had likely noticed a slight hesitation at certain RPMs, maybe a very subtle roughness at idle. You'd only feel it if you were paying attention. He was writing the fault codes in his notebook when he noticed it. He wasn't sure what made him look. Some small inconsistency in the geometry of the dashboard, the way the grain of the panel didn't quite line up the way it should have on the passenger side, the seam that was almost invisible but not entirely. He leaned across the center console and looked more carefully. There was a panel, a concealed one, built into the lower section of the passenger side dash, disguised as a structural element. The gap at the edges was nearly nothing, a few millimeters, and the surface matched the surrounding material so well that under normal circumstances and normal lighting, you'd never see it. But Ethan had spent 15 years finding things that were hidden inside cars: mice nests inside air filters, water damage inside door panels, rust behind body filler that had been painted over and sold as clean. He had a mechanic's eye for what wasn't quite right. He looked at the seam for a long time. His hand was maybe 6 inches from the panel when he stopped. He had no way of knowing what was in there. Cash, maybe. Documents. Something that belonged to someone powerful enough to show up in Cedar Ridge with 2 men in expensive jackets and a car worth more than his entire building. Something that person had specifically chosen to conceal. The note had said, "Repair only what is necessary." He hadn't been asked to look inside the car. He'd been asked to fix it. Whatever was in that compartment wasn't his business. Whoever owned this car had a right to their privacy, same as anyone who left a vehicle in his care. He'd had people leave wallets in cup holders before. He'd always set them on the front seat where they couldn't be missed. He'd had people leave prescription medications, personal letters, one time a handgun in the glove box that he'd removed, locked in his office safe, and returned with a careful conversation about proper storage. He'd never once looked through anything that wasn't his. This was no different. He leaned back across to the driver's side, made his notes, and got out of the car. He stood beside it for a moment in the quiet of the garage, the rain still hammering the metal roof. Noah was asleep 10 feet away. The diagnostic reader sat on the seat. The notebook was in his hand. He walked to the supply shelf, gathered what he needed for the job, and got to work. The spark plug for cylinder 7 was accessible without drama. He'd worked on more difficult engines in worse conditions with less appropriate tools. He replaced it, cleared the code, ran the engine to verify the fix. The idle smoothed out immediately, the subtle roughness gone. The oxygen sensor took longer. He had to trace the wiring carefully, check the connection at the sensor itself, follow the harness back toward the ECU. He found it eventually, a connector that had worked itself partially loose, likely from road vibration over time. He reseated it, applied proper dielectric grease to prevent recurrence, replaced the locking clip that had worn through. He cleared the code and let the car run through a complete drive cycle simulation on his diagnostic unit to confirm the fix held. It held. By midnight, the job was done. Clean. Both issues resolved. Nothing had been touched that didn't need touching. He hadn't changed the oil, which was slightly past due according to the vehicle's own indicator, because the note had said only what is necessary and low-mileage synthetic in a car driven this little wasn't a safety issue. He hadn't detailed the interior. He hadn't adjusted the tire pressure, which was marginally low on the rear left, because marginally low wasn't dangerous, and he hadn't been asked to check tires. He wrote up the invoice. Parts plus labor, calculated at his standard rate. He added a line for the diagnostic inspection. He did not add a premium for the car's value or the inconvenience of the hour or the strangeness of the arrangement. He added up the total. It was less than $500. He looked at the number for a moment, aware of how absurd it must seem to whoever owned a vehicle worth $250,000 to be charged less than $500. But that was the work done. That was the number. He printed the invoice, folded it into an envelope with the fault code report, and set it on the passenger seat. Then he noticed the watch. He hadn't seen it when he'd first gotten in. It must have been sitting in the gap between the passenger seat and the center console, tucked just far enough back to be invisible at a glance. But when he reached in to place the invoice envelope, his fingers found it. A watch, heavy, metal bracelet, the kind of watch that announced itself by weight before you even looked at the face. He pulled it out and turned it over in the shop light. It was a Patek Philippe. He recognized the name from an article he'd read once, the kind of magazine left in a waiting room at a specialist's office in Greensboro when he'd taken Noah in for an ear infection 2 years ago. An article about watches as investments. the watch in his hand. He didn't know the exact model, but based on the case style and what the article had described, he was looking at something that started around $40,000 and went up from there. He stood very still. The watch had been left in the car. Accidentally, obviously. It wasn't in the compartment. It was just wedged in the seat gap the way things got wedged in seat gaps when you lived with a vehicle long enough. Someone had taken it off, perhaps while driving, perhaps to make a call, and it had slipped. He found a small Ziploc bag in the office supplies drawer, the kind he used for storing small parts. Placed the watch inside, labeled the bag with a marker. Found in vehicle, passenger seat area, and set it on his desk next to the invoice copy. He'd figure out how to return it in the morning. The note had a phone number. He turned off the bay lights, checked on Noah, still out, still in his shoes, one arm still hanging, and sat down at his desk. He looked at the Bentley through the office window. Its charcoal paint caught the single desk lamp and gave nothing away. He had found something worth a great deal of money in that car. He had chosen not to open a compartment that was none of his business. He had charged a fair price for work that could have been billed at multiples of what he'd charged, and no one would have blinked. None of that felt like a decision. It felt like just how things were done. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the small notebook where he kept Noah's school schedule, doctor appointments, baseball practice times. Thursday was show and tell. Noah had spent 3 evenings this week deciding whether to bring his collection of state quarters or the toy rocket that had belonged to Ethan's own father. He'd ultimately landed on the rocket. Ethan made a note to make sure the rocket was clean and presentable. He turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the rain ease off on the roof, listening to his son breathe from the couch in the corner, listening to the particular silence of a small garage in a small town that had no idea what had just been parked inside it. At some point, he got up, moved to the couch, eased Noah's sneakers off without waking him, and pulled the fleece blanket up around the boy's shoulders. Noah stirred slightly, made a small sound, and burrowed deeper into the worn cushions. Ethan sat back down at his desk. He had a water heater that was dying upstairs. He had a gas bill due Friday. He had 7 vehicles scheduled for the rest of the week, and 2 of them were going to require conversations he wasn't looking forward to. The Hendersons' minivan had frame rust that was worse than it looked from outside, and Frank Bellamy's pickup had a transmission that was expressing its last wishes. He had a son who would be 7 for another 4 months, and who asked good questions, and who had his mother's eyes, and who still believed, at least partially, that a rocket from his grandfather deserved to be shown to his class. The watch sat in its labeled bag on the desk. The Bentley sat in the bay. The note sat on the workbench with its 212 area code and its precise, controlled handwriting. He'd call in the morning. He went upstairs, set his alarm for 5:30, lay down on his bed without changing, and stared at the ceiling for exactly as long as it took exhaustion to finish the argument with his brain. He was asleep before 11:30. The Bentley sat in the garage below, silent and expensive and full of secrets he hadn't touched. The alarm went off at 5:30, and Ethan was already half awake, the way he usually was on mornings after he'd slept in his clothes. There was a particular kind of tired that came not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of everything running in the background of your brain all night. The gas bill, the water heater, the Hendersons' frame rust, Frank Bellamy's transmission. He sat up, rubbed his face with both hands, and for about 4 seconds forgot completely about the Bentley downstairs. Then he remembered. He went down in his socks, coffee mug in hand before the coffee had actually finished brewing, which meant he'd gone back up for it, which meant he was standing at the garage bay door looking at the charcoal gray Continental before he'd had a single sip of anything. The car sat exactly where he'd left it, quiet, composed, looking like it belonged somewhere significantly more impressive than a 2-bay garage in Cedar Ridge with a hand-painted sign out front that had been fading for 2 years. He went to his desk, found the number from the envelope, and called it. It rang 4 times. He was preparing himself for voicemail when someone answered. A woman, but not the one he'd expected. Young, professional, the kind of voice that had been trained to reveal nothing. "Walker Automotive?" she said, which startled him because he hadn't identified himself yet. "This is Ethan Walker, yes." "We've been expecting your call, Mr. Walker. Is the vehicle ready?" "It is. I also need to return a watch. A Patek Philippe. Found it in the passenger seat area." A brief pause. brief enough that he almost missed it. Yes, that will be returned to the owner. We'll arrange pickup later today. Is that convenient? Anytime before 6. Someone will be there by noon. He started to say something about the invoice total, some explanation of the work done, but the line clicked before he got there. He stood with the phone in his hand for a moment, then set it down and went back upstairs to finish his coffee while Noah slept. By 7:15, Noah was awake, cereal-stained, and deeply committed to a conversation about whether dinosaurs would have been good at baseball. By 7:45, Ethan had dropped him at school, reminded him about the rocket for show and tell on Thursday, watched him disappear through the double doors without looking back the way 7-year-olds do, and driven back to the garage. His first appointment was at 8. By 8:10, he'd diagnosed the Hendersons' minivan and was composing in his head the conversation he was going to have with Linda Henderson about the frame rust, which was extensive enough that the repair cost was going to push toward what the vehicle was worth. It was never a comfortable thing to tell someone. Some mechanics avoided the conversation by burying it in jargon or softening it until the customer didn't understand what was actually being said. Ethan didn't see the point in that. You told people the truth and let them make their own decisions about it. The Bentley sat in the second bay and he worked around it. She came in at 9:45. He didn't look up immediately, Kat. He was under the minivan on the creeper, checking the extent of the rust on the rear subframe, and he heard the door chime, heard footsteps on the concrete, and called out, "Be with you in a second," without emerging. "Take your time," she said. He finished the section he was documenting, made his note, and rolled out from under the van. She was standing near the service counter, not touching anything, looking around the garage with an expression that was neither impressed nor dismissive, just observational, the way someone looks at a place when they're actually trying to understand it rather than just waiting for service. She was wearing dark jeans and a simple gray jacket, the kind that looked plain until you noticed the cut of it, the weight of the fabric. No visible jewelry, hair pulled back. She looked like she could have been an attorney from Asheville or a professor from Chapel Hill, or any number of things that would have explained the careful way she held herself without being obvious about it. She didn't look like she owned a $250,000 car, which, he thought briefly, was probably the point. "What can I do for you?" he asked, wiping his hands. "My car's been making a noise," she said. "A clicking sound, comes and goes. Mostly when I'm accelerating from a stop." "What are you driving?" "A 2020 Subaru Outback," she paused. "It's outside." "Pull it into the other bay. I'll take a look." She went to get the car and he pulled the Bentley partially forward to make room. When she came back in, she parked the Outback and got out with the same economy of movement she'd had before. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. He put the Outback up on the lift. The clicking on acceleration from a stop had a short list of probable causes, and he went through them in order. He found it inside of 10 minutes. The front left CV axle boot had torn, and the joint was running dry, just beginning to wear. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it was going to become catastrophic if it didn't get addressed. He lowered the lift and came around to find her standing a respectful distance from the work area, watching. "Your front left CV axle joint is drying out," he said. "The boot's torn. It's early enough that I can replace the boot and repack the joint, which is the cheaper option. But if you've been driving on it a while, sometimes the joint itself has already started to wear, in which case you're better off replacing the whole axle assembly." "Which do you recommend?" "I'd want to inspect the joint itself before I told you that. Pull the axle, check the wear pattern. If it looks clean, boot and repack. If there's pitting or roughness, whole assembly." She nodded slowly. "How much is the difference?" "Boot and repack, maybe $140 with labor. Full axle, closer to $280. "Okay," she said. "Do it right." He looked at her. "That's not an answer. Do you want me to inspect first and give you the specific recommendation? Or, do it right," she said again, and there was something in her voice that wasn't impatient but was very definite. "Whatever needs to be done. Don't cut the corner because it's cheaper." He almost said something else but caught himself. "All right. I'll pull it, check it, try it, and call you with what I find." "I'll wait." "It'll be an hour at least." "I have time." She sat down in the waiting area, 2 plastic chairs and a small table with a stack of magazines from 4 months ago, and took out her phone. He went back to work. He pulled the axle inside of 20 minutes. The joint had pitting, not severe, but there. He wasn't going to recommend the half fix on something that was already showing wear. He went to the waiting area doorway. "Joint's worn," he said. "I'd go full axle." She looked up from her phone. "Okay. I haven't given you the exact total yet. I trust you." He held her gaze for a moment. There was something steady in the way she said it that wasn't naive. She wasn't someone who trusted easily or blindly. That much was plain from the way she looked at things. It was more like a statement of position. "I've decided to trust you, and I'm not going to spend energy second-guessing that." $268, he said. "Parts and labor." "Fine." He went back to work. She didn't talk much while she waited, which he appreciated. Some customers liked to hover near the bay and ask questions, and he answered those questions honestly and completely every time. But the ones who let him work were easier on his concentration. She made 2 phone calls, both brief, both conducted in a voice low enough that he caught only fragments. Something about a meeting being moved, something about a filing deadline. The voice she used on the phone was different from the voice she'd used with him. Sharper. More clipped. Like a different setting on the same instrument. Noah called at 11:15 because he'd left his lunchbox in the truck again, which meant Mrs. Patterson from the office was calling the garage number, which meant Ethan had to call the school back, apologize, and arrange for Noah to get the hot lunch, which Noah actually preferred anyway, but which made Ethan feel like he was failing at something small and important every time it happened. He had the call on speaker while he torqued the axle nut, kept his voice even, didn't let the flash of frustration at himself come through to the person on the other end of the line. When he hung up, he noticed she had lowered her phone and was watching him work. "Sorry about that," he said. "Don't be." She paused. "How old?" 7. She looked at the workspace around him, the organized chaos of a functioning shop, the couch visible through the office window, the small pair of sneakers sitting next to the desk leg, the child's drawing taped to the side of the parts cabinet. Noah had drawn it last winter, a man under a car, the car rendered as a brown rectangle on 4 circles, the man rendered as a stick figure with what Noah had called working clothes. There was a sun in the corner of the drawing, very yellow, very large. "His mother?" she asked, which was the kind of question that could land wrong or right, depending on how it was asked, and she'd asked it carefully, without pressure. "Not in the picture," Ethan said, which was the phrase he'd landed on after years of trying other ones. It wasn't the whole story, but it was a true part of it, and it shut down the follow-up questions without being hostile about it. "I see," she said. She didn't push. He finished the job at 12:20. The Outback was solid, the axle seated correctly, the torque specs met, the undercarriage inspected for anything else that might be quietly failing. Nothing else was. He printed the invoice and brought it to her. She paid in cash. He noticed that not many people did anymore. He gave her the receipt and her change and walked her to the car. She opened the driver's door, then stopped. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "If you found something in a customer's car," she said, looking not at him but at the car door handle, "something that wasn't yours, what would you do with it?" He wasn't sure why the question felt like it had weight. "Depends what it is. A phone, a wallet. I put it somewhere visible and text the customer to let them know. Cash. I note the amount and put it in an envelope and keep it in the safe until pickup. If someone came in here and left a bag of money in their back seat, I'd still return it. It's not mine." She looked at him then. "Even if you needed the money?" It wasn't really a question. He answered it anyway. "Especially then." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the way people do when they've heard the answer they were checking for and have confirmed something private. "Thank you for the work," she said. "Drive safe." She pulled out of the lot and turned right onto the road, back toward the highway. He watched the Outback until it cleared the bend, then went back inside. The Bentley was still in the bay. The men arrived to pick it up at 12:50. Not the same 2 as the night before, but 2 others, same jackets, same economy of presence. They checked the car, found the invoice envelope on the passenger seat, and one of them brought it back to Ethan at the service counter. "The owner will review and remit payment," he said. "That's fine. There's also a bag on my desk. Labeled." A watch. The man collected the bag without opening it, examined the label, and nodded. The owner wanted me to convey their appreciation for the prompt service, the man said. Sure. And for the discretion. Ethan looked at him. The man's expression was professional and told him nothing. Just doing the job, Ethan said. They drove the Bentley out of his lot at 1 o'clock, and the garage felt different without it. Not emptier exactly, but more itself, less strange. He went back to the Hendersons' minivan and continued documenting the frame rust for Linda Henderson's call, which he'd scheduled for 3. He didn't think about the woman from the waiting area again until he was picking Noah up from school at 3:40. Noah climbed into the truck, dropped his backpack on the floor, buckled himself in with the particular determination of someone who'd been told too many times to do it without being asked, and said, Dad, if someone gives you $100 and says keep the change, do you have to keep the change? Ethan pulled out of the school lot. Where'd that come from? Caleb said his dad found money in a parking lot and kept it, and his mom said he should have tried to return it, and his dad said finders keepers. What do you think? Noah considered this with genuine seriousness. I think finders keepers is a rule for like erasers, not money. Ethan looked over at him. That's pretty much right. So you'd try to return it? Yeah. Even if you really needed it? Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Especially then. Noah was quiet for a moment, and Ethan could hear the gears turning. Because if you keep something that isn't yours, you know you did it, Noah said finally, even if nobody else does. Yeah, Ethan said. Exactly that. Noah seemed satisfied with this and moved on to a detailed account of what had happened at lunch, which involved a milk carton, someone named Darius, and a disagreement about the rules of Foursquare that had apparently been elevated to the level of a serious diplomatic incident. Ethan listened, asked the right questions, and let his son talk. The payment arrived 2 days later. A wire transfer. Clean, prompt, from an account identified only by a reference number. The amount was exactly what the invoice said, not $1 more or less, which told him the owner had looked at the itemization and paid what was owed without trying to negotiate or inflate. He appreciated that. It was the financially rational behavior of someone who understood value clearly. He filed the transfer confirmation and moved on. 11 days after the Bentley left his lot, the woman in the gray jacket came back. She drove the Outback again. He saw it pull in from under the hood of a Jeep Cherokee he was working on, and he recognized the car before he recognized her, then recognized her when she got out. She was dressed differently this time. Darker jacket, different shoes, but the same quality of clothing, the same careful absence of unnecessary detail. She came to the service counter. The car's fine, she said, before he could ask. No issues. Then what can I do for you? I was in the area. She looked around the shop again, that same observational quality from before. I was going to get a coffee somewhere. Thought I'd check in. He wasn't sure what to do with that. People didn't generally check in with their mechanics as a social activity. He noted the oddness of it, but not suspiciously, more with the mild curiosity of someone who'd been working with people long enough to know that they didn't always announce their actual reasons for anything. There's a diner about half a mile down on Route 9, he said. Millie's, coffee's decent. Pie's better. I know it, she said. Something in the way she said it was slightly off, like she'd caught herself. She redirected smoothly. Do you take a lunch break? He looked at the Cherokee. He'd been planning to eat the sandwich he'd made at 6:30 at his workbench, the way he did most days. Not formally, no. I'd like to talk to you, she said, if you have time. He studied her for a moment. She met his gaze without flinching, without the discomfort of someone trying to hide something, but also without the complete openness of someone with nothing to manage. There was a calculation in there somewhere, carefully contained. He couldn't tell exactly what it was about, and that mattered less to him than the fact that she'd asked directly rather than working around it. Give me 20 minutes, he said. He cleaned up, told Marcus, his part-time help, 19 years old, currently in his second year of community college studying automotive technology, good instincts and the occasional attention problem, to keep an eye on the bay, and drove his truck down to Millie's. She followed in the Outback. They got a booth by the window. The lunch crowd was thinning. Betty Millie herself came over, which she did when she recognized someone and wanted to make them feel known, and Ethan ordered the turkey club he always ordered and coffee. The woman, he still had no name for her, ordered coffee and the apple pie, which he noticed and said nothing about. The pie came first. She cut into it without ceremony. "Tell me how you ended up here," she said. Not in Cedar Ridge. She made it sound broader than that. How you ended up doing this. "I'm good at fixing things," he said, "and this town needed someone who was." "You could be good at fixing things in a lot of places." "I could." He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. "My son's school is 2 miles from the shop. I can see the parking lot from the road on my way to the gas station. If something goes wrong, a call, a sick day, anything, I'm 7 minutes away." She absorbed this. "That's the whole reason? It's the main one. Most people would hire someone else for that level of proximity. Pay for it. I'm not most people, and I'm not at a point where paying for it is the simpler option." She looked out the window at the street. A pickup drove past, someone Ethan knew, Dave Carver from the hardware store, who waved without looking to see if anyone was watching. "Do you ever feel like you're wasting something?" she asked. "Being here." It was a blunt question, and she seemed to know it, didn't apologize for it. He considered it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "when I look at what I could be doing if things had gone differently, yeah. But I don't waste a lot of energy there." He picked up his coffee. "My son is going to remember what his father was like when he was 7. That's not something I can make up later." She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a cloud moved and the light through the window changed. "I had a father who was going to be present later," she said. The words were flat, deliberately. "He was very busy becoming something. He got there." She cut another piece of the pie. "He got there. He didn't push." She clearly hadn't said it to invite a conversation. She'd said it the way people say things that have been sitting too long, released more out of pressure than design. "The pie's good," he said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Yeah, it is." They talked about the shop, about Cedar Ridge, about the economics of running a small independent business in a town being slowly circled by the chain service centers off the interstate. She asked good questions, specific questions, the kind you only asked if you'd already thought about the subject in some depth. He answered honestly, including the parts that weren't flattering, the months where the numbers were tight, the equipment he'd been delaying replacing, the reality that one major mechanical failure in his own infrastructure could push him into a place that would take years to recover from. She listened without offering solutions. He appreciated that too. He didn't ask her name. It seemed like if she'd wanted him to have it, she would have offered it. She'd said she wanted to talk, and this was what talking had turned into, and he wasn't going to manage it more than necessary. When they were done, he reached for the check. She was faster. "I asked you here," she said. "I'm aware. So I'll get it." He let her. He wasn't going to perform a struggle over $12. They walked out into the thin November sunlight and stood on the sidewalk. She turned up her collar against the wind, which had sharpened since morning. "Thank you for the company," she said. "Sure." He looked at her. "Are you going to tell me your name at some point?" The corner of her mouth moved again, more definitively this time, something that resolved into an actual expression. "Probably," she said. She got in the Outback and drove away. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the car go, feeling like he'd just sat through a conversation where the actual conversation had been happening slightly to the left of the words. He wasn't sure what she'd been measuring or why she was measuring it, and he was bothered by that approximately as much as he was bothered by most things he couldn't control, which was not very much. He drove back to the shop and finished the Cherokee. She came back the following week. And the week after that. Always the Outback, always a plausible reason. A concern about the wipers, a question about tire rotation. Once she brought a thermos of coffee and sat in the waiting area and read while he worked without explaining the visit at all. He stopped expecting an explanation. She'd come in, they'd exchange conversation that ranged from brief and practical to longer and stranger. And then she'd leave. He found out she was staying at the bed and breakfast on Elm, the Callaway house, run by Agnes Purcell, who had been running it for 22 years and who would give Ethan the full rundown on any guest who'd spoken more than 4 sentences to her, which was most guests. He found this out because Agnes mentioned the woman when she brought her car in for an oil change. Quiet one, Agnes said. Very polite. Pays in cash. Does her calls outside, like she doesn't want to be overheard in the common rooms. Which you'd think was suspicious, except she also helped me carry in the groceries from my car twice and remembered that I take my tea without milk. Agnes paused. She asked about you. Ethan kept his eyes on what he was doing. Asked what? How long you'd been here, whether you were well-liked in town, whether anyone had ever had a complaint about your work. Agnes watched him with the particular attention of someone who enjoyed knowing things. I told her nobody had a complaint that I'd heard, which is true, and that you'd been here since you were 26 and you'd fixed my husband's truck twice for what I was sure was less than you should have charged, and he never had another problem with it, which is also true. I appreciate that. She seemed satisfied. Agnes accepted her invoice. Pretty woman, good manners, expensive shoes. He thought about it that evening while he made dinner. Noah was doing homework at the kitchen table, or was supposed to be, and was actually drawing a detailed illustration of a dinosaur playing baseball, which Ethan didn't mention because the math would still get done eventually, and the dinosaur was extremely well rendered for a 7-year-old. He thought about the Bentley. He thought about the compartment he hadn't opened. He thought about the watch he'd returned. He thought about the invoice he'd calculated at his standard rate for a car whose owner could have paid 5 times that without noticing. He thought about a woman who showed up repeatedly at a garage in a small town with questions that were too specific to be casual, dressed carefully to look like she wasn't dressed carefully, asking about his life in ways that were probing without being intrusive. He thought about the pie. He wasn't certain. Not fully. But he was a person who paid attention to the things in front of him, who had been doing that his whole working life, who had learned that the things people didn't say were frequently more informative than what they did say. He thought that the Bentley and the woman might be the same story. He didn't do anything with the thought. There was nothing to do with it. If she wanted him to know something, she'd tell him. If she didn't, that was her right. He hadn't asked her name and she hadn't volunteered it, and neither of those things had stopped the conversations from meaning something, in the quiet, specific way that conversations sometimes meant something without either party acknowledging it out loud. Noah finished the dinosaur and moved on to the math without being asked. Ethan served the pasta and they ate, and Noah talked about Thursday. Show and tell was this week. The rocket was ready. He'd cleaned it himself with the old toothbrush Ethan had given him for the purpose, and he was prepared to explain to the class that it had belonged to his grandfather, who had worked on aircraft in the military, which was as much as Ethan had told him, because it was as much as Ethan knew with any certainty. Do you think they'll think it's cool? Noah asked. I think some will and some won't, Ethan said. That's usually how it goes. What if nobody thinks it's cool? Then you know it's cool and that's enough. Noah thought about this and clearly found it partially satisfying and partially insufficient, which was honest and appropriate for a 7-year-old. He went to bed at 8:30, argued briefly and without real conviction for 9, accepted 8:45 as a compromise, and was asleep before Ethan had finished the dishes. Ethan stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the back lot of the garage below, dark now, the security light catching the corner of the lot, a thin skin of frost beginning to form on the windshields of the 2 vehicles waiting for next-day service. He'd been in this town for 6 years. He'd built something real here, something that ran on consistency and honesty, and showing up and doing the work the same way whether anyone was watching or not. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't large. But it was his, entirely, without compromise, and that was a thing he'd come to understand was worth protecting. Whatever was happening with the woman in the gray jacket, whatever she was measuring, whatever conclusion she was moving toward, he was going to be exactly what he was. Not because he knew he was being watched, because there was no other way he knew how to be. He turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Noah one more time before bed. His son slept the way children slept when they felt safe, completely, ungracefully, one leg hanging off the mattress, the rocket sitting on the nightstand where he'd placed it ready for Thursday, clean and silver under the small nightlight. Ethan straightened the blanket, turned off the nightlight, and stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. Outside, Cedar Ridge was quiet. Somewhere in the Calloway house on Elm Street, a woman who hadn't given him her name was making decisions that he didn't know about yet. He went to bed and didn't dream about any of it. She came back on a Thursday. Ethan knew it was Thursday because Noah had done show and tell that morning and had called at lunch. Through Mrs. Patterson again. Through the same patient school secretary who had become an accidental fixture in their communication system, to report that the rocket had been, in his precise words, a big hit with most people, and Caleb said it was fake, but Caleb is wrong about everything. Ethan had gotten off the call smiling in a way that lingered into the afternoon, the private satisfaction of a good morning making the rest of the day easier to move through. He was in the middle of replacing the serpentine belt on a Dodge Caravan when he heard the car pull in. He knew from the engine note it wasn't the Outback. Different displacement, smoother, quieter, in the particular way that expensive engineering made things quiet. He came out from under the hood with a wrench in his hand and confirmed what some part of him had already worked out. The Bentley was back. Not delivered this time. Driven. She got out of the driver's side and stood beside the car and looked at him across the lot with the same steady expression she'd been giving him for 3 weeks, except there was something different about it today. Something that had come unhitched from the careful management she usually applied. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, like she was slightly unsure of what she was about to do. He set the wrench on the hood of the Caravan and walked out to meet her. They stood about 6 feet apart in the pale December light, the Bentley between them and the road, the garage sign behind him catching a gust of wind and swaying on its bracket the way it always did, and which he kept meaning to fix. "That's your car," he said. It wasn't a question. She took it as one anyway. "Yes." He looked at the Continental, then back at her. "The other one. The Outback. Borrowed. From a colleague." He nodded slowly. He'd been right then about the Bentley and the woman being the same story. He'd been right about most of it. Being right about it didn't produce the satisfaction it might have. It produced instead a kind of quiet sobriety, because being right meant the weeks of conversation at Millie's and in the waiting area and in the garage bay had been something other than what they'd appeared to be on the surface. Not dishonest exactly, but layered, constructed. "You want to come inside?" he said. She did. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine on the office counter, the machine that ran on grounds he bought in bulk from the warehouse store in Greensboro because the single-serve pods were 60 cents each, and he made too much coffee for that math to work, and handed her one. She held it with both hands. The office was small and slightly cluttered, the way working spaces got when efficiency took precedence over organization, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at Noah's drawing on the cabinet and didn't say anything for a moment. "My name is Victoria Hale," she said. He knew the name, not the way you knew someone personally, but the way you knew names that showed up in business news and automotive industry coverage, the kind of articles his parts supplier had forwarded to him twice in the past year with comments like, "This woman is changing the whole distribution model, and you should know who she is." Victoria Hale, 30 years old, CEO of Hale Automotive Group, which had started as her late grandfather's regional dealership chain and had been transformed under her into something global and aggressive and worth, according to one article he'd skimmed, somewhere north of $4 billion. He sat down across from her. "Okay," he said. She looked at him carefully. "That's all? Okay?" I had a reasonable guess it was something like that. The car, the men, the note. He wrapped his hands around his own mug. "The weeks of showing up. You didn't say anything. You didn't ask me to." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the lot and the garage sign swayed again on its bracket. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You don't owe me anything, but I'll hear it if you want to give it." What she told him was this. She'd been running Hale Automotive for 4 years, and in 4 years she'd made decisions about people, hiring, promoting, trusting, that had cost her, in ways she was still calculating, not financially. The company was financially healthy, but she'd promoted people who presented well and performed poorly in the specific way that mattered most to her, which was the way a person behaved when they thought no one was tracking them. She'd given authority to people who managed up brilliantly and extracted from below without conscience. She'd trusted advisors who'd told her what she wanted to hear rather than what she needed to know. She'd developed, over time, a practice. When she encountered someone who was in a position to act with or without integrity, a vendor, a partner, a potential hire, she created conditions where the choice was available, and she watched. Not entrapment, nothing manufactured. She put the situation in front of them honestly, or as honestly as she could, and let them show her who they were. The Bentley had been her car. The hidden compartment contained, she said without specifying further, documents related to an ongoing legal matter that would have been extremely valuable to certain people and extremely damaging to her if they'd been copied or photographed. The watch had been genuinely lost. She hadn't planned that. But it had become part of the picture. The invoice, she said. You charged $462. That was the work done. Ethan. She said his name in a way that acknowledged she'd been using it for weeks without full permission. The diagnostic alone on a vehicle of that value typically runs $600. Shop rate premium for Bentley service is standard. You charged your standard rate. You returned a $40,000 watch with a handwritten label on a Ziploc bag. It wasn't my watch. No, it wasn't. She looked at her coffee. I've done this test, versions of it, 7 times in 4 years, with 7 different people in 7 different contexts. You're the first one who passed every part of it. He sat with that for a moment. What happened to the other 6? 2 kept cash that was left visible in the vehicle. One had the compartment open within 20 minutes. I had a sensor. One overcharged by 400% and would have gone higher. One kept the watch. She paused. One passed the vehicle test and failed a different one later. Trust has layers. He looked at her across the desk. She looked tired, he thought. Not from the day, but from something longer than a day. The kind of tired that came from spending years operating in a world where you couldn't take anything at face value and had developed systems to compensate for that, and where even the systems were exhausting. I'm not angry, he said. She looked slightly surprised. Most people would be. Most people would feel manipulated. I get that. He considered it. But you left a car here, and I fixed it honestly. You came in as a customer, and I dealt with you honestly. I didn't do any of that because I thought I was being watched. I did it because that's how I do things. He set his mug down. You watching doesn't change what I did, so I don't have a lot to be angry about. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a very rational response to finding out you've been under observation for 3 weeks. I'm a practical person. She almost smiled. The almost smile was something he'd cataloged over the weeks. It appeared at specific moments, when something caught her genuinely, rather than through the managed surface she wore most of the time. It looked more like her than the composed default did. Then she straightened slightly, and something shifted in her posture. The same shift he'd noticed during her phone calls at the shop. The setting change. She was moving into something more formal. He watched it happen. I want to offer you a position, she said, within Hale Automotive. He didn't say anything. Director of Operational Integrity, she said. It's a new role. I want to create it around someone who actually understands what operational integrity looks like from the inside. Someone who's lived it rather than studied it. She named a salary figure that was more than 3 times his current annual income. Full benefits. Relocation assistance to New York or to our Southeast Regional office in Charlotte. Equity stake in a performance fund that... No, he said. She stopped. The words sat in the small office, and neither of them moved for a moment. I haven't finished the... I appreciate it, he said, and I mean that without any performance. What you're describing sounds like a serious offer, and I can tell you put thought into it. He looked at her directly. The answer is no. She set her coffee down with a precision that was, he thought, her version of taking a breath. Can I ask why? Noah is 7, he said. He's going to be 7 for another 3.5 months. Then he's going to be 8 and 9. And I'm going to be present for that, physically present, the way my father was not. For reasons that were partly his fault and partly circumstance, and partly just the way things broke. I made a decision when Noah was 2 and his mother left, and I was 29 years old and I had a garage and a kid, and no particular plan, and the decision was that being there was the non-negotiable thing. Everything else was negotiable. Being there was not. She was watching him with the kind of careful attention she gave to things that were informing her understanding of something. Charlotte is 4 hours, she said. The Southeast office, 4 hours is 4 hours. That's a different life than 2 miles. He wasn't combative about it. He said it the way he said things, straight, without decoration. I know what a director of operational integrity in a billion-dollar company's schedule looks like. I know what that demands. And I know that what I'm saying no to is extraordinary, and that most people would call me crazy for saying it. He looked at her. But I'm not most people. You already knew that. She was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 20 seconds. You could make more, do more, affect more people. I'm affecting the person I need to affect most right now, he said. When he's older and needs me in a different way, maybe the calculation changes. Right now it doesn't. She looked down at her hands around the coffee mug. Something crossed her face. Not quite pain, but a neighbor of it. He thought about what she'd said at Millie's. He was very busy becoming something. He got there. He didn't say anything about it. She hadn't offered it for comment, and he wasn't going to use it as leverage now. What if I told you I could structure the role to accommodate Victoria? It was the first time he'd used her name. It stopped her the same way she'd stopped him. I'm not negotiating. I'm not holding out for a better offer. I'm telling you what's true for me. She looked at him. The managed surface was completely down now. He could see it, the way you could see weather moving in over flat land before it arrived, a change in the quality of the light. Whatever she'd expected from this conversation, this specific configuration of it wasn't it. People didn't say no to Victoria Hale. Or if they did, they said it with caveats and conditions and suggestions for how the no might eventually become a yes. He'd just said no the way you closed a door, firmly, without slamming it, but completely. You're serious, she said. Yes. She looked at the drawing on the cabinet, the man under the car, the brown rectangle, the very yellow sun. She looked at it for long enough that he let her, didn't fill the silence. My father was going to be present later, she said, and this time it wasn't compressed the way it had been at Millie's. It came out more fully, like something that had been waiting for the right room. He built the company from the dealership my grandfather left him, worked 20-hour days for 15 years. I was the project that came after. I was going to be done properly once the company was stable. She paused. The company was never stable. There was always one more thing. And then he died of a heart attack at 61, and I was 22, and I knew the business better than I knew him, and I had $4 billion worth of something that had cost us both a great deal, and I couldn't tell you whether any of it had been worth it. She said it without self-pity, which made it hit harder than self-pity would have. She was reporting a fact about her life the way she might report a fault code. This is what happened. This is the outcome. This is the thing that cannot be repaired but must be understood. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. It's just history. She picked up her coffee again. I'm not telling you to make you feel bad about saying no. I'm telling you because you should understand why your answer is what it is, and why I can't argue with it. She looked at him. I can't argue with it. It would be obscene to argue with it. I know you're not arguing. I'm trying not to. There was a long quiet. Not uncomfortable, the kind that developed between people who had said something real and were giving it room. What's in the compartment? He asked. She looked at him. You don't have to tell me, he said. I'm asking because you have to know I'm curious, and I'd rather ask directly than pretend I'm not. She considered for a moment. Communications, she said. Internal, between members of my board and a competitor, regarding a potential acquisition that I wasn't meant to know about. The kind of thing that would have changed the dynamic significantly if it had reached certain people. Someone on your own board? 3 people on my own board. She said it without inflection, which was its own kind of inflection. They've since been removed. The legal matter is ongoing. He thought about the men with the expensive jackets, showing up in the rain at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday in November. The note with its precise handwriting. Repair only what is necessary. Do not discuss the vehicle or this arrangement with anyone. She hadn't been protecting the car. She'd been protecting evidence while testing whether the man holding it was worth trusting. Was the car actually broken? He asked. Yes. The misfire and the sensor were genuine. I needed it serviced, and I needed to test the mechanic, and it seemed efficient to do both. He almost laughed. Not at her. At the logic of it, which was extremely her. "That's very organized," he said. "I tend to be." He got up and refilled both their coffees without asking, because the cups were empty, and it seemed like the conversation had more to go. She watched him do it with that observational quality, and when he sat back down, she said, "Do you know what the hardest part of this job is? Not the legal exposure, not the board politics. The hardest part is that you reach a point where you can't easily tell who's real." Real how? Whether people are doing what they're doing because it's right or because you're watching. Whether someone's being honest with you because they respect honesty or because they want something from you. She turned the mug in her hands. After long enough in this position, you start to look at every interaction and ask yourself what the angle is. What's being managed? What's not being said? She looked up at him. You stopped looking for the angle. I don't live my life looking for angles. I know, that's what I'm saying. She set the mug down. It's harder than it sounds, to maintain, when everything around you operates on calculation. He thought about what that life was actually like, not the abstraction of it, the billion-dollar company and the board betrayals and the tests with the Bentley, but the daily lived texture of it, going through every room wondering what wasn't being said, eating lunch at Millie's with someone and wondering what they wanted from you. He thought about the fact that she'd come to Cedar Ridge and rented a room at Agnes Purcell's bed and breakfast and borrowed a colleague's Subaru and spent 3 weeks talking to a mechanic about nothing in particular, and he understood something about why she'd done it that wasn't fully about the test. You needed somewhere to not be that person for a minute, he said. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, it was with the kind of care that meant he'd landed somewhere accurate. It's a small town, she said. Agnes makes very good tea, and the conversation here is... She stopped. You don't have an angle. No. That's remarkably rare. I know. He said it without arrogance, just as the practical observation it was. You could find more people like that if you looked in places like this instead of in boardrooms. That's probably true. She looked at the window, at the lot outside, at the Bentley parked next to the fading sign. I'm going to have to go back. I figured. There's a board meeting in New York Monday. 3 ongoing legal depositions. A product launch in the first quarter that is not going well for reasons I won't bore you with. She paused. I've been here longer than I planned. How much longer? Significantly. Something in her voice shifted slightly. Something wry, self-aware. I came for a week at most. That was the original plan. He looked at her. You stayed because of the Outback visits. Partially. And partially because Agnes makes good tea. And partially because... She stopped herself, which was interesting. She redirected smoothly, the way she'd redirected before. You're easy to talk to, she said, in a way that isn't common in my life. He didn't make anything of that. He accepted it as the clean fact it was offered as. If you come back this way, he said, you can bring the Bentley. I'll do the oil change. It's coming up. She looked at him for a moment, the steadiness of it, the absence of anything underneath trying to be something else, and something in her expression settled, like a building accepting its foundation. Okay, she said. She left 20 minutes later. He watched the Bentley pull out of the lot and turn right toward the highway, the same direction the black SUV had gone 6 weeks ago. He stood in the doorway with the cold coming in off the road and let it go. Marcus came out of the bay with a question about the caravan's belt routing, and they went back inside and the work resumed, which was the thing about work. It resumed. The belt. The serpentine path it took around 6 different pulleys and 1 tensioner. The satisfaction of getting it right on the first try. He picked Noah up at 3:40. Noah had a permission slip for a field trip to the Natural History Museum in Raleigh, which required a parent's signature and, according to Noah, immediate attention because Darius had already gotten his signed and was, in Noah's assessment, being insufferable about it. Ethan signed it at the first red light, which was not ideal from a road safety perspective, but was clearly necessary to prevent further insufferability from Darius. Was it good today? Ethan asked. Yeah. Noah watched the town go past the window. Mrs. Keller said my rocket report was the best one. Report? I had to write about it, for extra credit. What it is and who gave it to you and why. He was quiet for a moment. I wrote about Grandpa. Is that okay? Of course it is. I didn't know that much, Noah said. So I wrote what you told me, that he worked on planes, that he was serious but not mean, that he fixed things. He looked at his father. Is that right? Yeah, Ethan said. That's right. I wrote that you're like him, Noah said, because you fix things too, and you're serious but not mean. He seemed slightly uncertain about this, the way kids got when they'd done something that felt like it mattered and weren't sure if it was allowed to matter. Was that okay to write? Ethan kept his eyes on the road. The town was thin around them. Bare November trees, the hardware store, the gas station, the stoplight at the center blinking yellow in the gray afternoon. Yeah, he said. That was more than okay. Noah seemed satisfied. He turned back to the window and watched the town pass, and Ethan drove them home through the cold. That night, after dinner, after Noah was in bed, after the dishes and the gas bill which he paid online because the due date was tomorrow. And he'd almost forgotten. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't particularly need and thought about what Victoria Hale had offered him. He thought about the salary number she'd said. He thought about what that number would mean for the water heater, for the equipment replacement, for Noah's college fund, which currently held enough to cover maybe one semester at a state school if things didn't change. He thought about the equipment replacement fund he'd been building for 3 years toward a new alignment rack. He thought about all of the things that number would have made easier. Then he thought about Noah at 2 years old, in the weeks after Sarah left, sitting in the middle of the garage floor while Ethan worked on a customer's car because he'd had no one else to watch him and the work couldn't stop. Noah at 2 had been the kind of toddler who found a thing and focused on it completely. He'd found the bottom rung of the creeper and spent 40 minutes pushing it back and forth, while Ethan changed oil 3 feet away, the two of them in a companionable parallel silence that Ethan could still feel in his hands if he thought about it. He thought about Noah at 7, asleep in the next room with the rocket on his nightstand, who had written a school report connecting 3 generations of men who fixed things. He thought about his father, who had fixed aircraft and not much else, who had been present for Ethan's childhood in body and somewhere else in mind, who had died of a stroke at 58 before Ethan could ask him the questions he'd accumulated over 30 years of trying to understand the gap between them. He thought about Victoria Hale's father building something enormous and leaving behind someone who knew the business better than she knew him. He thought about what Victoria had said. The hardest part is that you can't easily tell who's real. He thought about what it cost to live that way. He thought about the 3 weeks she'd spent in Cedar Ridge, in Agnes Purcell's house, borrowing a colleague's Subaru, eating pie at Millie's, sitting in a plastic chair in his waiting room with a thermos of coffee, and no particular explanation. He thought she was probably one of the most competent people he'd ever met, and one of the loneliest, and that those 2 things were almost certainly related. He finished his coffee and rinsed the mug. He checked on Noah. Still out, rocket still on the nightstand, blanket kicked to the foot of the bed the way it always was by midnight. He pulled the blanket up. Noah stirred, made a sound, settled. Ethan stood in the doorway. The house was quiet. The garage was dark below. The gas bill was paid. The field trip permission slip was signed. The serpentine belt on the caravan was correctly routed. Ray Pullman's truck had gotten to the tournament in Asheville without incident. Ray had texted a photo of the team with the equipment, a brief thanks man that arrived while Ethan was eating lunch. These were the things. Not glamorous, not large, but real, in a way that he'd chosen and would keep choosing. He went to bed. 3 days later, a package arrived at the garage. No return address. The handwriting on the label was the same precise, controlled hand from the first note, fountain pen, clean capital letters. Inside was a single bottle of motor oil, the specific full synthetic blend recommended for the Bentley's W12 engine, and a card. The card said, "For when I bring it back. VH." He put the bottle on the shelf with a label identifying it and went back to work. January came to Cedar Ridge the way it usually did. Without ceremony, just a hard drop in temperature and a sky that stayed the color of old concrete for days at a time. The garage was busier in winter. Cold did things to cars that other seasons didn't, killed batteries, thickened fluids, revealed every small structural weakness that summer had been hiding. Ethan kept a space heater running in the bay and wore an extra layer under his work shirt and stayed later than he'd planned on most evenings, the seasonal rhythm of it familiar enough that he moved through it without much resistance. He hadn't heard from Victoria Hale in 3 weeks. The bottle of oil sat on its labeled shelf. He didn't think about it every day. Some days he thought about it quite a bit, and on those days he generally found something mechanical to concentrate on until the thought passed, which it always did. Marcus had started asking better questions, which Ethan took as a good sign. Not better in the sense of more complex, better in the sense of more precise. The difference between a young mechanic who asked, "Why isn't this working?" and one who asked, "The pressure reading is showing this specific value at this specific point in the cycle. What does that tell us about where the failure is?" was the difference between someone guessing and someone thinking. Marcus was crossing that line slowly on the good days. On the bad days, he was 19 and distracted and put apart back in the wrong orientation and had to be walked back through it with the patience of someone who remembered being 19 and distracted. Noah had made it through the field trip to Raleigh without incident, which Ethan counted as a full success given that Darius had apparently tried to touch a Cretaceous-era fossil display and had been firmly redirected by a museum employee, an event Noah described with the narrative satisfaction of a natural storyteller. Ethan listened to the full account twice, once in the truck on the way home and once at dinner because Noah had refined the telling and wanted to deliver the improved version. He was washing his hands at the shop sink on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of January when his phone rang with a 212 number. Not the same one from the note, but close enough in the prefix that he dried his hands carefully before answering. "Mr. Walker." A woman's voice, different from the one he'd spoken to before. Older, more direct. "My name is Diane Cho. I'm Victoria Hale's chief of staff. She's asked me to reach out to you regarding a proposal she'd like to discuss. Would you be available for a call tomorrow morning?" I told her no, he said. "About the position." "This is a different proposal," Diane Cho said. She was clear that this was not a follow-up to the previous offer. "She asked me to tell you, and these are her words, that she heard what you said, and she's not trying to move the same chess piece twice." He leaned against the sink. Outside the office window, Marcus was torquing a wheel on a Honda Civic with the kind of focused attention that meant he was counting in his head, which was what Ethan had told him to do, and which Marcus had apparently adopted as practice. "What time?" Ethan said. 8, if that works." "That works." He spent the rest of the afternoon not thinking about it, which was not the same as not thinking about it, but close enough that he got through 3 jobs without losing his place. He picked up Noah, made dinner, helped with math homework, fractions, which Noah approached with the resigned fatalism of someone confronting an unfair universe, and put him to bed at the negotiated time of 8:45. Then he sat at the kitchen table and wondered what Victoria Hale wanted that wasn't the previous thing. The call came at 8:02 the next morning, which told him something about Diane Cho. Victoria was on the line too. He recognized her voice before she identified herself, the particular quality of it, the control of it. "Thank you for taking the call," she said. "You said it wasn't the same proposal." "It isn't." A pause, brief, organized. "I've been thinking about what you told me, about why you're in Cedar Ridge, about what the work means to you." Another pause. "I want to build something, near your shop, something that isn't going to take you away from your son or from the community you've built, something that brings the opportunity to you instead of asking you to go to it." He was quiet. "I want to fund an automotive training center," she said, "purpose-built, adjacent to your property. There's a parcel east of your lot that's been vacant for 11 years. I had someone look at the title situation, and it's clean. The idea is a working facility where young people from Cedar Ridge and the surrounding county can learn real automotive skills. Not a vocational program attached to a school system that underfunds it. A proper center with proper equipment, proper instruction." A brief pause. "With you at the center of it." He set his coffee down. "That's a significant investment." "Yes." "Why?" The question sat there. He meant it genuinely, not skeptically, but as an actual inquiry. She'd offered him $140,000 a year and a title, and he'd said no, and now she was proposing to build something in his town, adjacent to his garage, presumably at a cost of several $1 million in construction and equipment alone, and he wanted to understand the actual reason. "Because I can," she said. And then, after a beat, more honestly, "And because you showed me something I hadn't seen in a long time, and I want to be in proximity to whatever produced that, even if I can't take it back to New York with me." She paused. "That's the honest version. I appreciate the honest version. There's also a business rationale," she said. "Hale Automotive has a skilled trade shortage problem that is industry-wide and accelerating. We need trained technicians, and we're not getting them at the rate we need them. And the pipeline is broken at the education end. A well-run training center in an underserved market is something I can justify to the board as strategic investment. So it's not purely altruism. I want you to know that." He picked up his coffee again. "I like that you said that." "I thought you might." He looked out the kitchen window at the January light, thin and white on the back lot. The parcel east of his property was visible from here. He'd looked at it more times than he could count over the years. A flat rectangle of weedy ground behind a chain-link fence, an abandoned concrete pad from some previous structure that hadn't made it, the remnants of a gravel drive leading to nothing. He'd thought about it as potential parking expansion twice, and both times had gotten distracted by something more immediate. "What would it look like?" he said. "Specifically." She had specifics. She'd prepared this call, which didn't surprise him. 4 bays minimum, she said, purpose designed for instructional use, wider than standard to allow multiple people working simultaneously, viewing angles accounted for, proper ventilation and lighting. A classroom component, small, not a lecture hall, something that felt like a working environment rather than a school. A tool library, diagnostic equipment current enough to be relevant to vehicles the students would actually encounter in the industry. She had a figure in mind for the initial build-out and a separate operational budget for the first 3 years while the program established itself. He listened through all of it. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Your involvement, your presence, not administrative. I have people for the administrative work. What I need is what you actually are, which is someone who knows this work from the ground up and knows what it means to do it with integrity." She paused. The title would be something like lead instructor or technical director, whatever you're comfortable with. Your garage stays yours. Your schedule stays yours in the sense that your commitments to Noah stay primary. This is structured around your life, not the other way around. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she said, "Ethan?" "I'm thinking," he said. "Take the time." He thought about Marcus, who was getting better, who had arrived at his shop at 19 with more potential than training, and who was currently being shaped by whatever Ethan happened to demonstrate in any given day. He thought about how many Marcuses there were in Faro County. Kids with aptitude and no clear path toward it. No mentors with time and equipment and the willingness to show them what the work actually looked like when it was done right. He thought about the community college program in Greensboro that was technically available to them if they had transportation and the ability to structure their lives around a commute, which many of them didn't. He thought about what his own shop had been built on, the consistency of doing things the right way, the ethic that had apparently been visible enough to pass a test administered by one of the most exacting people he'd ever met. He thought about whether that ethic could be taught or whether it was only demonstrated. And then he thought about Noah writing the school report and connecting it to his grandfather, 3 generations of men who fix things, and he thought that maybe demonstration was enough. Maybe if you showed it clearly and consistently, and without exception, the people watching absorbed it. "I need to see the site plan," he said, "and I want to be involved in the equipment decisions, not overseeing, but involved. I know what's worth buying and what's a waste." A beat. Then, "Of course. And the program has to serve people from this county specifically, not a general regional program that pulls from 3 hours away. Local first." "Agreed. And I'm not putting my name on anything I'm not present for. If I'm the technical director, I'm actually there, actually teaching, not a figurehead while someone else runs it in my name." "I wouldn't have proposed it any other way," she said. "The whole point is you." He exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said. A small silence. "Okay meaning T? Okay meaning yes. Let's build it." He could hear something change in her voice. Not dramatic, not celebratory, just a kind of release, like a structural tension resolving. Good, she said. I'll have Diane send you the site documentation. We should meet in person when you're available. I can come to Cedar Ridge or meet you in Charlotte, whichever works. Cedar Ridge, he said. You know where the garage is. She was quiet for a moment, and he had the impression she was doing the same thing she'd done in his office, that almost smile. Yes, she said, I do. They came in February. Not Victoria alone, she brought Diane Cho, who turned out to be a compact, efficient woman in her mid-40s who communicated almost entirely in direct sentences and kept a tablet with her at all times, and was, Ethan concluded within 20 minutes, the primary reason Victoria's company actually functioned as well as it did. She also brought an architect, a woman named Ren Takahashi from a firm in Charlotte that specialized in educational and vocational facilities, who walked the vacant lot with Ethan for 90 minutes in a cold wind and asked questions and listened to his answers with complete attention. Victoria stood slightly apart during the walkthrough, watching Ethan and Ren work through the site. And Ethan was aware of it the way you were aware of weather. Not intrusively, just as a background condition. They had lunch at Millie's, which by now had a specific gravity for them, and Betty Millie brought the apple pie without being asked, setting it in front of Victoria with the particular warmth she extended to people who had become regulars. Victoria looked at the pie and then at Ethan and said, She remembers. And Ethan said, Betty remembers everyone. And Victoria said quietly, I noticed. The logistics took 4 months. Ethan hadn't anticipated how much went into building something that didn't exist yet. The permitting, the site prep, the utility connections, the equipment sourcing, the conversations with Faro County's Workforce Development Office, who were initially skeptical and then cautiously enthusiastic and then actively engaged once they understood the scope. He was involved at the level he'd requested, not administrative, but present at key decisions, particularly equipment. He rejected 2 separate equipment packages that a vendor had proposed as comprehensive because they included outdated diagnostic systems that would prepare students for vehicles that were already being phased out. He sent specific alternatives. They cost more. Victoria approved them without pushback. Marcus found out in March, on a day when one of the project managers stopped by to confirm property boundary measurements, and Marcus, who had been in the second bay, came out to see what was happening, and Ethan explained it. Marcus stood with a torque wrench in his hand and looked at the vacant lot and then at Ethan. They're building a training center, Marcus said. Here, next to us. Yes? For mechanics. For automotive technicians, yes. Marcus looked at the lot again, at the weedy rectangle with the broken concrete pad, at the chain-link fence running along its east edge. Because of you? Because someone thought it was needed, Ethan said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was a kid who felt things thoroughly and processed them slowly, and that was fine. Ethan had learned not to rush him through the gap between feeling something and finding words for it. Are you going to teach there? Marcus finally said. Yes. What happens to here? This stays. This doesn't change. Marcus looked at him with the particular expression of someone young enough that their face hadn't yet learned to contain everything it was registering. When it opens, can I help teach? Ethan looked at him. The torque wrench. The oil-stained jacket. The 19-year-old who had started 8 months ago not knowing the difference between a torque spec and a general guideline, and who now counted in his head and asked precise questions and had recently diagnosed an intermittent electrical fault on a 2017 Ram 1500 that Ethan had been impressed by. Ask me again when the center opens, Ethan said. Let's see where you are. Marcus nodded, which meant he understood that this was not a no. He went back inside. Ethan stood at the lot boundary for a moment, looking at the ground that was going to become something. Ground broke in May. It was a Friday, late morning, and the ceremony was deliberately small. Victoria had vetoed anything that felt like a press event, which Ethan appreciated. The project manager was there, Ren Takahashi, Diane Cho. Agnes Purcell had heard about it through the channels by which Agnes Purcell heard about everything and showed up with a small tin of cookies that she pressed on Diane Cho with the authority of someone who considered baked goods a form of social infrastructure. Dave Carver from the hardware store came over because he'd seen people gathering from his window and was constitutionally unable not to be part of something happening on his street. Noah was there because it was a Friday, and school had let out at noon for a teacher professional day, which Ethan had remembered with 20 minutes to spare and arranged pickup accordingly. Noah stood beside his father and watched the machinery and said, "Is this ours?" "It's the community's," Ethan said. Noah considered this. "But you're going to be in charge of it. Part of it. So kind of ours." Ethan looked down at him. "Kind of ours," he agreed. Victoria crouched down to Noah's level, which she did without making it a production, and said, "Your dad is going to teach people here. A lot of people. Is that okay with you?" Noah regarded her with the particular scrutiny he applied to adults who spoke to him as if his opinion mattered, which he was not used to from people he'd only met twice. "He already teaches Marcus," Noah said. "Marcus doesn't know everything yet." "Marcus has time," Ethan said. "Yeah, but he put the filter on backwards that one time." That was 7 months ago. Victoria's expression broke into something that wasn't the almost smile. It was an actual one, complete and unmanaged, and Ethan saw it and noted it as the rare thing it was. She stood back up and looked at the broken ground and at the equipment and at the gathering of people from a town that hadn't known her name 3 months ago. "Thank you for letting me do this," she said to Ethan. "It's your money," he said. "It's your place," she said. "There's a difference." Construction moved through the summer. The center was designed to read as connected to the existing neighborhood, brick rather than metal panel. Windows along the north side of the Bay Area, a low roofline that didn't dominate the streetscape. Ren Takahashi had listened to Ethan's concern that it not look like something imported from elsewhere, like an institutional object dropped into the middle of what was a working residential and small commercial block, and she'd addressed it in ways that Ethan could see even without the architectural vocabulary to name them. It looked like it belonged, not after years of weathering, immediately, from the first week the brick went up. He walked through the space during construction on a Saturday in July with Noah, who had developed a serious interest in the mechanical aspects of the building process, and who wanted to know how the vehicle lifts were going to be anchored. The concrete subfloor was in, the lift anchor points marked, the electrical roughed in. It smelled like concrete dust and new lumber and the particular metallic smell of fresh conduit. "There are 4 bays," Noah said, counting the lift anchor clusters. "How many people can work at once?" "In a class, 6 to 8 per bay, but they rotate. Some are working, some are watching, some are at the diagnostic stations." "Can kids come?" Ethan looked at him. "What do you mean? Like, can I come? When you're teaching, you'd probably be bored." Noah gave him a look that contained a full argument without using words. "Dad, I have been in your garage my whole life. You've been in it since you were 2, so I've never been bored in a garage." He walked to the nearest lift anchor point and crouched over it, examining the embedded hardware with genuine interest. "I could help." "You could observe," Ethan said. "When you're older, you can help." Noah stood up and nodded with the decisiveness of someone who had just made a plan he intended to see through. He was 8 now, had turned 8 in March with a birthday that involved a cake Ethan had attempted from scratch, and which had structural integrity issues but tasted fine, and a baseball glove that Noah had been wearing around the house for 2 weeks before the baseball season actually started. 8. Still in his shoes at night sometimes, still called the school office instead of Ethan's cell because he kept forgetting to save the number. Still the center of everything. The center opened in October, which was 13 months after the Bentley had been delivered to Ethan's garage on a rainy Tuesday night. The opening wasn't a ceremony exactly. Victoria had approved a community open house Saturday morning, doors open, coffee and pastries from Millie's, people from the county coming through to see the space and meet the staff. The Faro County Workforce Development Director came and spoke for 7 minutes, which was the right length of time for that sort of thing. A reporter from the regional paper took photos. Agnes Purcell brought more cookies. Ethan stood at the front of the Bay Area with 12 people who were going to be in the first cohort, ranging from 19 to 37, from Cedar Ridge and 3 neighboring towns, 2 women and 10 men, with backgrounds ranging from no mechanical experience at all to several years of informal shop work, and looked at them and felt something he couldn't immediately name. Not pride, exactly. Something adjacent. The particular sensation of a decision you'd made correctly revealing itself over time. "I'm going to tell you something first," he said, "before we talk about engines or tools or diagnostics." He looked across the group. "This job can be done dishonestly very easily. You can tell a customer their car needs work it doesn't need. You can charge for parts you didn't replace. You can rush a job and cover it, and nobody finds out for 6 months. And plenty of people in this industry do exactly that." He let it sit for a moment. "We're not doing that here. Not because someone's watching, because the work matters, and the people bringing their cars to you are trusting you, and that trust is the only thing worth protecting in this job. Everything I teach you, that's underneath it." The group was quiet. A couple of them, the older ones, nodded with the recognition of people who'd encountered the other version of this industry and knew it was real. "Okay," he said, "let's start with how an engine actually works. Not the textbook version. What's actually happening inside the thing, physically, when you turn a key." Marcus was there. Not as a student, but as a second instructor, a title he'd been given 3 weeks prior after a conversation in which Ethan had looked at him steadily and said, "You're ready to show people what right looks like." And Marcus had gone slightly pale in the way that meant he believed it and was terrified by it. He taught the second bay cohort with a precision that Ethan watched from a distance and found genuinely satisfying, the way teaching always was when the student became someone the teacher could learn from. Victoria attended the open house. She flew in Saturday morning and flew back Sunday afternoon. The board meeting she'd mentioned, the ongoing legal proceedings, the product launch in its second phase. She'd made clear she wasn't relocating to Cedar Ridge, which neither of them had suggested, and she'd made equally clear that the center's operations were Ethan's domain, not hers. She'd built it. He ran it. She walked through the bays during the open house, spoke to several of the new cohort members, examined the diagnostic equipment with the practiced eye of someone who'd grown up around this industry, even if from the ownership side rather than the technical side. She stopped at the alignment rack, the one Ethan had specified, the one he'd been planning to replace in his own shop, and ran her hand along the calibration bar the way he'd run his hand along the Bentley's quarter panel that first night. "This is good equipment," she said. "I know. I picked it." She looked at him. The something in her expression that had been loosening incrementally over a year was fully loose now. The managed surface still there, because it was her nature and her training and she'd need it for the boardroom Monday morning, but below it something more straightforward. "I meant the whole thing," she said, "not just the rack." "I know," he said. "Thank you for building it." He meant it completely, and she received it that way. Later in the afternoon, after the open house crowd had thinned and the coffee was gone, and the reporter had left and Agnes had gone home having distributed every cookie she'd brought, Ethan found himself sitting on the tailgate of his truck in the lot between the garage and the new center. Noah was inside the center's classroom with 2 of the cohort members who had been showing him the computer diagnostic interface, which Noah had apparently taken to with alarming speed, and which had produced in the cohort members the specific expression of adults who hadn't expected to be shown up by a second grader. Victoria came out and sat on the tailgate next to him. She had her jacket on, the good one, the one that looked plain until it didn't. The October air was cool and specific. Wood smoke from somewhere down the street, the clean underlying cold of the season beginning to establish itself. "How does it feel?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Unfinished," he said. "In the right way. Like it's the beginning of something that I can't see the end of yet." She was quiet, looking at the new building, the brick, the windows, the sign above the bay doors that said, in clean letters, Cedar Ridge Automotive Training Center, and below that, smaller, operated in partnership with Hale Automotive Group. "I almost put your name on the sign," she said. "I know, I asked you not to." "You did." She paused. "Most people would have wanted it. I don't need my name on the building. I need the work to be good." He looked at the sign. "If the work is good, people will know anyway." She turned to look at him, not the observational look from a year ago, but something more direct. She'd earned directness with him over a year of imperfect, non-performed conversation, and she seemed to know it. "Can I ask you something I have no right to ask?" "Probably." Do you ever regret it? Not the position, not what I offered you, just the shape of the life, the size of it, the... She stopped, searching for the right word, and landed on the narrowness of it. He thought about Ray Pullman's truck getting to the tournament in Asheville. He thought about Marcus counting torque specs in his head. He thought about a boy on a couch with duct-taped armrests, growing into a boy who wrote school reports about men who fix things, growing into a second grader being shown up on diagnostic software by adults who should have known better. He thought about a rainy Tuesday night and a compartment he'd closed without opening. No, he said. The life doesn't feel narrow from inside it. She looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the sign, at the building, at the thing that existed now that hadn't existed a year ago. The October light was going orange at the edges of the sky behind the tree line, the kind of late afternoon that made everything look more considered than it was. Okay, she said, not conceding, accepting. They sat on the tailgate until Noah came out of the building at a run, holding a printed diagnostic report he'd apparently generated himself from the training computer, which he presented to Ethan with the energy of someone who had discovered something important. The report was for a vehicle that didn't exist. He'd apparently entered fictional parameters. But the format was correct, and the process had been correct, and his understanding of what the numbers meant, when Ethan asked, was also roughly correct. "Where'd you learn what the codes mean?" Ethan said. Noah looked at him like the answer was obvious. You say them all the time." Ethan looked at the report, then at his son, then back at the report. He felt something move in his chest. Not sentimentality, or not only that, something more structural. The particular sensation of realizing that the things you did every day were entering another person, quietly, without announcement, becoming part of how they understood the world. "Good work," he said. Noah accepted this and moved on to asking Victoria whether Hale Automotive made any electric vehicles, which produced a conversation that lasted 20 minutes and which Victoria engaged in with complete seriousness, answering his questions with the specificity they deserved. Ethan stayed on the tailgate. The light kept going. The building held its shape against the evening sky. Inside, the equipment waited, patient, expensive, real, for Monday morning and the first full week of instruction and the long, slow, unglamorous work of building something that could last. He watched his son talk to the most powerful person in the automotive industry about battery chemistry and thought that whatever happened next, the ground under it was solid. He'd laid it himself, one honest day at a time, when nobody was watching. The first cohort graduated on a Friday in April, 17 months after the Bentley had appeared in Ethan's lot in the rain. It wasn't a graduation in the formal sense. No stage, no gowns, no processional music. Ethan had resisted every suggestion that moved in that direction, not because ceremony was wrong, but because the ceremony that fit this particular thing wasn't borrowed from somewhere else. What they did instead was a final assessment day. Every student working through a real diagnostic problem on a real vehicle, observed by Ethan and Marcus, and two master technicians that Ren Takahashi had connected them with from the Charlotte area, people who worked in dealerships and independent shops, and who could speak to whether what they were seeing in these 12 students was actual competency or the convincing appearance of it. 11 of the 12 passed. The one who didn't, a 24-year-old named Curtis, who had the best instincts in the cohort and the most inconsistent execution, was told he could repeat the final module and retest in 60 days. Curtis took the news the way people took news that was fair, but painful, which was quietly and with the jaw set against whatever was trying to come out of it. Ethan spoke to him afterward, privately, in the office. "Your diagnostic process on the electrical fault was the best in the room today," Ethan said. Curtis looked at the floor. "But I didn't pass." "You didn't finish. There's a difference. You found the fault correctly, and then you got ahead of yourself on the repair sequence and skipped a verification step. That's a habit problem, not an aptitude problem." Ethan leaned against the desk. "Habits take longer to fix than aptitude, but they fix." Curtis was quiet. 60 days. 60 days. In the meantime, I want you in the bay 3 mornings a week running through verification sequences until they're as automatic as breathing. He paused. "If that's what you want." Curtis looked up. Something in him resolved. "Yeah," he said. That's what I want. He passed the retest in 48 days. Ethan didn't make a particular thing of it, just recorded the result and shook the man's hand and said, "You're certified," in the same tone he'd used to say any true thing. Curtis nodded and went back to work, which was the correct response. The 11 who passed on assessment day were absorbed into the county's labor market with a speed that surprised everyone except Ethan, who had spent 16 years watching good mechanics be immediately employable because there were never enough of them. 2 went to an independent shop in Millbrook. 3 were hired by a fleet maintenance operation out of Greensboro that serviced county vehicles and had been short-staffed for 2 years. 1, a 37-year-old woman named Patricia Oakes, who had been working as a grocery store manager and who had the most methodical diagnostic mind Ethan had encountered outside of a professional context, was hired by a Hale automotive dealership in Charlotte at a senior technician rate that started higher than what she'd been making after 11 years in retail management. Patricia called Ethan the week she started. "It's different," she said, "the way they do things there. Not bad, but different from what we learned." "Different how?" "Faster, less deliberate. They want the car done and out. I keep doing the full verification sequence and my supervisor thinks I'm slow." "Are you finding things other people miss?" A brief pause. 3 times in 8 days, yeah. "Tell your supervisor that," he said, with specifics, not as an argument, just as information. She did. The supervisor apparently had listened. She called again 3 weeks later to say that 2 of her colleagues had adopted the verification approach. Ethan filed this away as something that mattered, the way method spread when it produced results that were visible to the people around it. By the time the second cohort started in January of the following year, the center had a waiting list. Ethan hadn't anticipated the waiting list. He'd hoped for steady enrollment, enough students to justify the operation, enough throughput to demonstrate value to the county partnership and to Victoria's board. What he hadn't anticipated was the specific quality of word that spreads in small towns and rural counties when something works, which is different from advertising and different from reputation. It was more like the thing that happened when someone who'd been through the program came home and their family saw what they could do and told someone who told someone. Patricia Oak's mother had apparently been telling people at her church for 4 months. Curtis, after his retest, had gone back to his neighborhood in a town 12 miles east of Cedar Ridge and talked to 3 young men he'd grown up with, 2 of whom applied for the second cohort and 1 of whom was accepted. The waiting list meant decisions, not just about capacity, about what the program was and what it was going to stay. Ethan understood that the easiest move was to scale, more cohorts, more instructors, faster throughput, higher numbers to show in the annual report that the center's board and Hale Automotive's board would both be looking at. He understood the logic of it and resisted it. He had a call with Victoria in February about it. She was in New York, and what he'd come to understand was her primary working location, the office overlooking Lower Manhattan, where most of the decisions got made, where she worked the hours her father had worked and had not yet found a way to work less of them. "You have a waiting list of 42 people," she said. "I know. And you're running 1 cohort at a time with 12 students. 13 this year." She was quiet for a moment, which meant she was thinking about how to make the case without making it the wrong way. He'd learned to read her silences over the past year. She had a silence for calculating, and a silence for managing, and a silence for when something had genuinely caught her, and this was the calculating one. "If we added a second parallel cohort," she said carefully, "we could serve twice the instruction quality drops," he said. "I know, because I've been watching what happens when I'm in 2 places trying to pay half attention to each. The work isn't the same, the students know it, and I know it. Marcus could lead the second cohort." "Marcus is good. He's not ready to run a cohort independently, maybe in a year." Ethan sat back in his chair. The office at the center had become his primary working space. His garage office still existed, still had Noah's drawing on the cabinet, but the center's office was where the administrative reality of the program lived. "The waiting list is a problem I want to solve the right way, not the fast way." A pause. "What's the right way?" "Grow the instruction capacity before we grow the enrollment. Bring Marcus up fully this year. Identify 1 or 2 people from the current cohort who show aptitude for teaching. There are at least two who I think could develop into instructors with the right support. Build from inside. He paused. And I want to talk to the community college in Greensboro about a pathway program. Some of these people on the wait list would be better served by a structured academic credential alongside the practical training. We could design something. She was quiet, the genuine catch silence this time. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since October. You didn't mention it. I was still working it out. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, small and private. Most people in your position would have come to me with a proposal the moment they had the beginning of an idea, to demonstrate initiative. I'm not most people. No, she said. You keep proving that. The community college conversation happened in March. Ethan drove to Greensboro with a folder of program documentation and met with the vocational studies dean, a man named Robert Ingram, who had been running variations of this conversation with various county programs for 20 years, and who could identify within 10 minutes whether he was talking to someone who wanted a partnership or someone who wanted to borrow his institution's name. He identified Ethan correctly as the former, and the meeting that had been scheduled for 45 minutes ran 2 hours. The pathway program they designed together took 8 months to formalize, because formalizing things between a private training center and an accredited community college involved bureaucratic processes that had their own timeline regardless of how motivated the parties were. Ethan found this frustrating in the specific way that practical people found bureaucracy frustrating, which was not with rage but with the low-grade, persistent friction of watching a simple thing take a complicated path. He did the paperwork. He attended the meetings. He drove to Greensboro when he needed to and joined calls when he didn't and moved the thing forward. The only way things like that moved forward, which was incrementally and without shortcut. Noah, who was 9 by then, had developed a theory that the amount of paperwork something required was inversely proportional to how useful it actually was. He presented this theory at dinner one evening in March, with the confidence of someone who had arrived at a genuine insight. Ethan told him it wasn't quite right, but was closer to right than most adult theories he'd heard this week. Noah took this as a compliment, which it was, approximately. The Pathway program launched in the fall of that year. 11 students from the center's second and third cohorts enrolled in the Associated Community College curriculum alongside their practical training. It meant longer days for them, 2 days a week in Greensboro on top of the training center schedule. But the 3 Ethan tracked most carefully moved through both with the specific seriousness of people who understood they were building something for themselves that couldn't be taken away. Marcus turned 22 that fall and led his first independent cohort with 4 students, which was the right number for a first independent leadership, and which produced 2 people who passed their assessments cleanly and 2 who needed extension and got it. Ethan debriefed with Marcus after each weekly session, not correctively, more like 2 people comparing notes on the same problem from different angles. Marcus had developed his own teaching style, which was different from Ethan's in ways that were genuinely complementary rather than just different. Where Ethan taught by demonstration and precise verbal instruction, Marcus taught by questions. He asked students to narrate their own reasoning process out loud as they worked, which exposed the gaps in their thinking in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable but consistently effective. "Where'd that come from?" Ethan asked him once, after watching Marcus work a student through a misdiagnosed fuel delivery issue by asking questions for 12 minutes without once suggesting an answer. Marcus shrugged. "That's how you taught me. Mostly. You never just told me the answer. I gave you the answer plenty of times, when I'd already worked as far as I could, but you always made me work first." He paused. It was annoying. Did it work? Obviously. He said it without arrogance, just as the fact it was. So I do the same thing. Ethan looked at him for a moment. 22 years old, standing in the bay of a training center that hadn't existed 3 years ago, having just taught something. "You're a better teacher than I was at your age," he said. Marcus was quiet for a beat, absorbing this. "I had a better example," he said finally. Ethan didn't respond to that. He went back to what he was working on. But the thing sat in him the rest of the day, the particular weight of realizing that what you'd done had mattered to a specific person in a way that was now moving outward, through that person's hands, into other people. The compounding effect of it, the way integrity, passed on, became something larger than itself without losing what it was. It was 3 years and 4 months after the opening when Victoria Hale came back to Cedar Ridge for more than a brief visit. She'd been back 9 times in that period. Ethan had stopped counting after 6 because it had ceased to feel like an event and become instead a regular feature of the calendar. She stayed at the Calloway house every time. Agnes Purcell had given her a standing reservation in what Agnes now called, without apparent irony, Victoria's room. Agnes and Victoria had developed, over 3 years of repeated proximity, the kind of relationship that formed between very different women who recognized in each other a certain quality of will. Brief, wry, mutually respectful, occasionally exasperating on both sides. But this visit was longer. She'd told Ethan in advance that she'd be in Cedar Ridge for 2 weeks, which was the longest she'd been away from New York since before the company went global. The reason, she said on the phone, was that she had a board restructuring to finalize, and she'd decided she could finalize it from anywhere with reliable internet, and she'd chosen here. He'd said, Agnes will be happy. And she'd said, Agnes has already told me what thread count the new sheets are. And that was the whole of the conversation about it. She came on a Monday, and the first thing she did before going to the Calloway house was stop at the training center where the current cohort, the 5th, was midway through their 3rd week. She stood in the doorway of the main bay and watched for 10 minutes without announcing herself, which she'd stopped bothering to do because everyone recognized her now and because the students were more interesting to her unobserved than observed. Ethan was at the far end of the bay, walking a student through a valve timing problem. He knew she was there. He had a mechanic's awareness of what was in his peripheral field, a professional habit of tracking the space around him, but he finished the sequence before acknowledging her. When he turned, she was watching him with an expression he'd come to know as her learning face, the one that appeared when something was informing her understanding of things in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. You never stop teaching, she said when he came over. I'm not going to stop in the middle of a thought because someone walked in. I didn't say it critically. I know. He looked at the bay, at the 5 students working or observing. It's a good cohort, more women this time, 3 out of 8. The word is spreading differently. Patricia Oakes, she said. She came back in February. Talked to the 2nd and 3rd cohort women for an afternoon. Told them what her first year at the dealership had actually looked like. He paused. Not the polished version, the real one. The skepticism she'd encountered, the way she'd had to establish credibility. What worked and what didn't. They listened. He looked at her. She's coming back in June to do it again. Victoria was quiet for a moment. That should be a formal mentorship component, she said. I know. I'm working on structuring it. Let me structure it, he said, not dismissively. Then I'll tell you what I need from you. She looked at him, and whatever small impulse she'd had to offer resources before the problem had been fully shaped, an old habit, the CEO reflex of immediately converting problems into resource questions, she let go. Okay, she said. They had dinner that evening at Millie's, which had become by now the default location for conversations that needed something other than an office, the same corner booth, Betty Millie's apple pie arriving without being ordered, the particular familiarity of a place that had absorbed enough of their history to function as a kind of third presence in the room. They talked about the board restructuring she was finalizing, which she described with the specific language of someone who'd been through it, the legal complexity, the negotiated exits, the replacement candidates she'd vetted through a process that was more rigorous and more human than the ones she'd used before. She'd hired a researcher to spend time with each candidate's former colleagues before she interviewed the candidates themselves. She'd asked the researcher to look specifically for patterns of behavior in low-visibility situations. You made that standard practice, Ethan said. I made a version of it standard practice. She turned her coffee mug. It's not a Bentley in a garage in Cedar Ridge. It's more structured than that. But the principle is the same. He nodded slowly. He hadn't known she'd done that. Extended the practice, institutionalized it in some form. It settled somewhere in him in a way he didn't fully examine at the table. Does it work? He said. Better than what I was doing before. She paused. It doesn't catch everything. Nothing catches everything. But it shifts the baseline. She looked at him. I've hired 4 people in the last 2 years using that process. All 4 have been what they appeared to be. That's a better rate than I had before. That's something. Yes, it is. The conversation moved. The way their conversations moved now, without the careful architecture they'd had in the beginning, the scaffolding that had been necessary when they were still figuring out what the other person actually was. They talked about Noah, who had turned 10 in March, and who had recently informed Ethan with great certainty that he wanted to be either an automotive engineer or a marine biologist, and who was keeping both options open with the energy of someone who didn't yet understand that you eventually had to pick. They talked about Marcus, who had applied to a part-time master's program in vocational education at NC State, and who had been accepted and who was going to be a significant institutional problem for the training center in 18 months when his schedule became complicated, which was a good problem to have and a real one. They talked about the community trust. Victoria had proposed it 8 months ago, a formal transfer of the center's operational governance into a community trust structure, which would mean the center was not owned by Hale Automotive and not owned by Ethan, but by a board drawn from the community itself, with Ethan holding the technical director role and a vote, but not control. The legal work had been complex and had taken longer than either of them had expected, but it was nearly finalized. "The filing happens next week," she said. "I know. Diane sent me the documents." "How do you feel about it?" He thought about the question honestly. "Like it's right," he said. "The center doesn't belong to me. I didn't fund it. I didn't build the building or the systems or the partnership with the college. I shaped it, but—" He stopped. "If it only exists because I'm here, then it's fragile in a specific way. The trust makes it real. It makes it belong to the place instead of to the person." She watched him. Most people would want the control. Most people would be wrong about what control is worth. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to say something publicly, at the trust signing, about what this has been and what you did that made it possible." He looked at her. "Victoria, not for you, for the record, for the people who are going to run this thing after us." She held his gaze. "They need to know what it was built on, not the money, what it was actually built on." He held her gaze. "Keep it short," he said. "I will keep it approximately short," she said, which was not the same thing, and both of them knew it. The trust signing was on a Thursday in late October, 4 years and a handful of days after a rainy Tuesday night when a Bentley had appeared in the lot, and Ethan had worked through the dark and not touched anything that wasn't his. The day was cool and dry. The trees around Cedar Ridge at the particular edge of peak color that lasted about 5 days, and which everyone in the county rearranged their schedules to account for without admitting that they were doing it. The room was the center's classroom, the small one, designed to feel like a working space rather than a lecture hall, which it did. Present were the 7 members of the new Community Trust Board, which included a former county commissioner, Agnes Purcell, a pediatrician from the town's medical practice, 2 of the center's graduated students, including Patricia Oakes, who had driven up from Charlotte, a representative from the community college, and Dave Carver from the hardware store, who had been nominated by a write-in process that nobody had quite organized formally, but which had produced a clear result. Also present, Marcus, Diane Cho, Ren Takahashi, who had driven up from Charlotte and who sat in the back and observed with the architect's eye she brought to everything, Robert Ingram from the community college, several of the current cohort who had been invited because it seemed wrong to have them 2 buildings away from something that was being done in their name, and Noah, who was 10 and sat beside his father in the front row, and whose legs didn't quite reach the floor, and who held in his lap the toy rocket from his grandfather's estate, which he'd brought without being asked to bring anything, which he'd simply appeared with that morning, and which he now held with the particular care of something understood to have weight beyond its physical mass. The trust documents were signed with the methodical care of legal processes, each board member in turn, Ethan last as the transferring party, his signature the one that made the center no longer his in the specific sense of belonging to one person, and made it instead what it was going to be for as long as the community decided it should be. Victoria spoke after the signing. She stood at the front of the room without notes. Ethan had halfway expected notes, the prepared precision he associated with her professional register, but she'd come without them, and what came out was different for it. I want to tell you what happened 4 years ago, she said. Not the business version of it. What actually happened. She looked at the room, the board, the students, the people who'd built things here. I sent a car to a garage I'd researched because it was the most straightforward option for a test I'd been running. I was looking for a specific thing. I was looking for someone who would behave correctly when there was no incentive to do so, when the money was available and no one was watching and the cost of taking it was effectively zero. She paused. Ethan Walker returned a $40,000 watch in a Ziploc bag with a handwritten label. He charged $462 for work that could have been billed at 3 times that amount. He looked at a hidden compartment and closed it without opening it, not because he suspected a test, but because it simply was not his to open. The room was very quiet. I've worked in this industry my entire adult life, she said. I grew up in it. I know what it is at its best, and I know what it is at its worst. And what I know is that the worst of it, the dishonesty, the extraction, the way it takes advantage of people who don't understand the machines they depend on, all of that exists in a world that has decided it's normal, that it's the way things are. She looked at Ethan. This man did not decide that. He decided something else, and he decided it every day in a shop with a fading sign and a child sleeping on a couch in the corner with no audience and no reward. And what I'm signing today is the acknowledgement that what he built out of that decision is worth more than what I brought to it. The money built the building. He built everything inside it. She stopped there, which was where Ethan had needed her to stop, and sat down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he stood up because the room seemed to require something from him and looked at the people in front of him, the board, the students, Marcus in the second row with his hands clasped and his jaw set against the emotion he'd been processing for 10 minutes. I'm going to say this once, Ethan said, and then we're going to eat the food Agnes brought and we're going to go back to work. He looked at the room. I didn't do any of what she described because I was trying to be something. I did it because it was the job. The job is to do right by the person who trusted you with their vehicle. That's the whole job. Everything I've ever taught, everything Marcus teaches, everything Patricia teaches when she comes back, it all comes from that one thing. He paused. This building doesn't change that. The trust doesn't change that. What happens after I'm gone doesn't change it. The job is still the job. Do it right when no one's watching. Do it right especially then. He sat down. Noah looked at him from the chair beside him, the rocket in his hands, his mother's dark eyes fully present and considering. That was short, he said. That was the right length, Ethan said quietly. Noah thought about it. Yeah, he said. It was. The food was good. Agnes had, as always, brought more than was needed. The conversation in the room afterward moved the way conversation moved when people felt something real had happened and were figuring out how to occupy the same space with it. Gradually, with humor finding its way in at the edges, with the specific relief of formality releasing into something more ordinary. Ethan stood at the back of the room with a cup of coffee and watched his people. Marcus talking to 2 of the current cohort students with his hands, the way he always did when he was being precise about something mechanical. Patricia Oakes and Agnes Purcell in a conversation that looked, from across the room, like 2 women comparing notes on managing things that were more complicated than they appeared. Ren Takahashi looking at the room she'd designed, the bay visible through the glass partition, the classroom they were standing in, the proportions she'd worked out in a cold wind with Ethan in a vacant lot, with the expression of someone looking at a thing that had become more than what it was designed to be. Victoria came to stand beside him. They stood at the back of the room and watched the space they'd made, together and separately, and in ways that were hard to categorize cleanly. What happens now? She said. The second cohort from the Pathway program finishes in December. 3 of them are going to be ready for dealership placement in January. I want to make sure Patricia's operation gets first look. He set down the coffee. Marcus needs a formal co-director title before the fall, or he's going to have credibility problems with the next cohort. The trust board needs to vote on that. Agnes has the motion ready. She looked at him. That's not what I meant. He looked back at her. Outside the window, a tree had let go of a mass of leaves in a gust, orange and yellow against the October sky, briefly suspended, then gone. I know, he said. They'd never named the specific thing between them, not because it was unnameable, but because neither of them had gotten around to it in the particular way that people who were focused on everything else in front of them sometimes didn't get around to things that mattered. It had been present anyway, in the way that true things were present whether or not you gave them a name. In the way she came back to Cedar Ridge again and again, and stayed at Agnes Purcell's house and ate pie at Millie's, and sat on the tailgate of his truck and talked about things that had nothing to do with business. In the way he'd kept the motor oil on the shelf, labeled, for when she brought the car back. "You don't have to figure that out today," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I'm not good at not figuring things out." "I know. You're working on it." She looked at him for a moment. "Am I?" "Little bit." Something crossed her face, the full smile, the real one, the one that looked more like her than anything else did. She didn't say anything else about it, which was correct. They stood in the room they'd made and watched the people in it, and outside the window the October light did what October light did, which was make everything look like it mattered more than it usually got credit for. Noah appeared at Ethan's side with a plate and a piece of Agnes's coffee cake, and the rocket still under his arm, managing all three with the dexterity of someone who'd been navigating crowded spaces since before he had the height for it. "Marcus says I can shadow a session next week," he said. "He said I have to ask you." Marcus said ask me, or Marcus said he'd let you if I said yes? Mostly the second one. Ethan looked at his son. 10 years old, the rocket under his arm, the dark eyes, the cake on the plate, half of which would make it to his mouth, and half of which would be negotiated away to someone else in the room, because Noah could not manage food in a social setting without distributing it, which was either a character flaw or a character quality, and Ethan had decided years ago that the distinction depended on who was looking. "Yes," he said. Noah processed this quickly, decided not to give Ethan time to add conditions, and moved back into the room with the energy of someone who had what he came for. Ethan watched him navigate toward Marcus and deliver the verdict, watched Marcus look over at him across the room with an expression of combined satisfaction and mild concern. Because Marcus knew what having Noah in a session actually meant, which was that he'd need to have answers ready for questions that weren't in the curriculum. Ethan raised his cup slightly in Marcus's direction. Marcus shook his head slightly in return, but he was smiling when he did it. There was a moment, one of those moments that happened without warning and couldn't be manufactured, where Ethan stood at the back of the room and took in all of it at once. The people, the space, the particular quality of a late October afternoon coming through the windows and landing on a room full of people who were, in various ways, building something that was going to outlast the afternoon. He thought about a rainy Tuesday night and two men in expensive jackets and a note that said, "Repair only what is necessary." He thought about a compartment he'd closed without opening. He thought about a Ziploc bag with a handwritten label. He thought about the specific moment when you were alone in a dark garage with a decision and no one watching, and how that moment was, in some sense, the only moment that ever really mattered. Because everything else you built rested on what you did in that moment, on whether the person you were when no one was looking was the same person you were when everyone was. He thought about his father, who had fixed aircraft and not much else. He thought about Noah, who would remember these years, who was already remembering them in the way that children remembered things. Not as events, but as textures, as the felt sense of what it was like to grow up around a particular way of doing things. He thought about what integrity actually was, stripped of the word, reduced to its practice. It wasn't the grand gesture or the dramatic refusal. It was the consistent, unremarkable, daily choice to do the thing right because the thing deserved to be done right. It was the verification step you didn't skip because no one would know if you skipped it. It was the invoice you calculated at your standard rate for a car whose owner would never have questioned twice the amount. It was the compartment you closed. He thought that the hidden compartment had been the wrong object all along, that the thing worth finding wasn't inside any car, wasn't in a dashboard, or a Ziploc bag or a legal document. It was in the daily practice of being exactly what you were when no one was watching, and trusting that this was enough, and being right about that in ways that only revealed themselves slowly, over years, in the faces of the people sitting in the room you'd helped build. He finished his coffee. He set down the cup. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and this had never felt like a burden to him. Not really, not at the center of it. The work was the thing. The work was where the decision lived, renewed every day. The same choice made again in small ways and large ways, and mostly in the unremarkable middle-sized ways that no one ever wrote about, but that were the actual substance of a life. He went back into the room. Noah appeared immediately with a question about whether marine biologists used diagnostic equipment, which was not a question Ethan had a strong answer for, but which he committed to researching because the question deserved a real answer. Marcus intercepted them both with a concern about the cohort schedule that turned into a 15-minute conversation about pacing. Agnes handed him a piece of coffee cake and told him he looked tired and he should sleep more, which was true on both counts. Victoria stood near the window talking to one of the trust board members, doing the thing she did where she listened completely and gave people the full weight of her attention, which was still one of the most valuable things she had to offer anyone, and which she'd gotten slightly better at offering without the careful management that had surrounded it when he'd first known her. She caught his eye across the room, briefly. Something passed between them. Nothing dramatic. Just the acknowledgement that two people gave each other when they'd made something together that they were both proud of and neither of them needed to say out loud. He nodded once. She looked back at her conversation. Outside, Cedar Ridge moved through its October afternoon. The sign above the training center bay doors caught the light and held it for a moment. Cedar Ridge Automotive Training Center. And then a cloud moved and the light changed and it was just a sign on a building again, ordinary, belonging to the street, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. Inside, the work went on.